Ever heard of European slaves forced to build the Ottoman Empire? Probably not something they emphasized in school, huh? Well, get ready, because that's exactly where today's deep dive is headed. We're talking a chapter of history that's, well, kind of been swept under the rug.
It's definitely one of those topics that can really challenge our perceptions of the past and even how we understand slavery in a broader context.
Let's set the stage, all right? Imagine the 16th to 18th centuries, the Barbary coast of North Africa, sun, sand, and, well, something else entirely. While the Atlantic slave trade was happening over here, there was this whole other drama unfolding on the Mediterranean.
And it was a drama with incredibly high stakes, lives lost, cultures clashing, empires rising and falling.
Our guide for this deep dive is a book called The Barbary Pirates and the European Slaves Who Built the Ottoman Empire. And let me tell you, just cracking open this book, the sheer scale of it all is mind-blowing.
It really makes you question everything you thought you knew about this period.
Right, we've all heard stories about pirates, right? Swashbuckling adventures, plundering ships on the high seas, all that. But these Barbary pirates, they are playing a different game, a much bigger, bolder game.
It wasn't just about random acts of piracy. There was a method to their madness.
Oh, absolutely. These guys were strategic. They didn't just hit ships. They went straight for the source coastal towns.
Imagine the audacity. Raiding towns in places like Baltimore, Ireland.
Or even parts of England. Devon, Cornwall, those places weren't immune.
It really flips the script on how we typically picture pirate activity.
And the crazy part is this wasn't just a one-time thing. They kept this up for centuries.
It's important to understand, though, these weren't your stereotypical yo-ho-ho pirates.
So we're not talking like Captain Jack Sparrow's long-lost cousins or anything.
Exactly. These were the Barbary corsairs. Essentially, they were licensed pirates, working for the rulers of those North African states, Morocco, Algiers, Tripoli, you name it.
So they had, like, official backing.
In a sense, yes. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement. The corsairs brought in wealth and captives, and the rulers turned a blind eye to their activities.
Okay, so what was in it for the corsairs? What were their motivations?
They were playing the long game. Profit was a huge factor, of course. Ransoms, the slave trade, all that. But it went deeper than that. They were also gaining power, weakening their European rivals, many of whom were Christian. It was a complex mix of economics, religion, and geopolitics.
You know, it's funny. I was reading something by Samuel Pepys, the English diarist from the 1600s, and he mentions running into former slaves like it was an everyday occurrence.
It's remarkable how commonplace it had become.
Right, and that's just one guy's diary. It really makes you realize how deeply ingrained this practice was. But here's the part that really makes you rethink everything. Historians estimate that over 250 years, the Barbary pirates captured around 1.25 million Europeans.
A staggering number, isn't it?
It's almost impossible to wrap your head around. To put that in perspective, that's nearly the scale of the transatlantic slave trade, just spread out over a longer period.
And it begs the question, why isn't this more widely known? Why don't we learn about this in school?
It's a good question.
Well, there are a few possible reasons. The Atlantic slave trade, tragically, dominates our understanding of slavery. It's what we're taught. It's what we see in movies. But it's crucial to remember that slavery wasn't limited to that one horrific chapter.
So it's like we focus on one thing and this other huge event gets overlooked.
Precisely. Plus, history is often told from a Eurocentric perspective. And then you have the complex layer of Arab involvement, which wasn't solely about race, like the transatlantic trade, but intertwined with religion and cultural factors, making it even more intricate.
Okay, so let's talk about the reality for those captured. What happened to these European slaves?
Well, imagine this. You're ripped from your home, your family, everything you know. You're sold into slavery in a foreign land, facing a language barrier, cultural differences, and the constant threat of violence.
Just the fear and uncertainty alone would be crippling.
Absolutely. And the conditions these slaves faced were often brutal. They essentially fell into two main groups, the public slaves and the private slaves.
Public versus private. What's the distinction there?
Public slaves were owned directly by the rulers. Think galley slaves, rowing massive warships until they collapsed from exhaustion. Others were put to work on construction projects, backbreaking labor, often with little regard for their well-being.
I can't even imagine.
One account even describes the bread they were given as something dogs wouldn't eat.
It's just the inhumanity. It's hard to fathom.
And then you had the private slaves. Their fate was more unpredictable.
How so?
Some were treated relatively well, almost like members of the household. Others, however, endured horrific abuse. subject to the whims of their captors.
So it was a complete crapshoot.
Essentially, yes. But regardless of their individual circumstances, these captives all shared one thing: the psychological trauma of being enslaved in a foreign land, the ever-present threat of violence, the fading hope of freedom, the sheer otherness of it all. It took a heavy toll.
It makes you wonder how anyone survived that ordeal.
It's a testament to human resilience, for sure. But it's also important to acknowledge the lasting psychological scars. One former slave even described the English as lacking resilience in captivity.
Really? That's interesting, considering how we often think of the British and their, well, history with colonization.
It challenges our assumptions, doesn't it? It suggests that cultural and national identity only go so far in the face of such extreme hardship.
So how did any of these European slaves ever escape this nightmare? I mean, we hear about ransoming in movies and stuff. Was that a common thing?
Ransoming was a huge part of this whole system, but it was a complex and often disheartening process, especially depending on where you were from.
What do you mean?
Well, Catholic and Protestant Europe had very different approaches to ransoming their people.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize religion played such a big role in this. So how did it work? Who did what?
Let's start with the Catholic side. They were surprisingly organized. They had religious orders like the Trinitarians and the Mercedarians who were dedicated to freeing captives.
Like a spiritual task force.
In a way, yes. These orders would collect money, negotiate with the Barbary states, even travel to North Africa to secure the release of captives. They had a whole system in place.
They even had a figure, Our Lady of Good Remedy, who was believed to intercede on behalf of captives.
Exactly. It's fascinating how religion played such a central role in their response. It provided comfort, hope, and a framework for action.
It's like they were running a whole operation.
They were. It was impressive, actually.
Meanwhile, the Protestant nations,
Not so much.
it's almost like they were reading from a different playbook entirely.
You could say that. Protestant nations like England, they had something called the Algerian duty.
Yeah.
Basically, a tax that was supposed to fund ransoms, but it wasn't always used effectively.
So the money was there, but the will, or maybe the organization, just wasn't.
That's a good way to put it.
And I bet the captives felt that difference.
Oh, absolutely. Imagine being stuck in captivity, clinging to hope, and seeing a more organized system working to free people of a different faith while your own government,
Seemed to be dragging their feet.
to put it mildly.
It's heartbreaking. Thousands of Dutch, German, and British captives just languishing in those Barbary prisons.
And their hopes often rested on governments that were, let's just say, less than enthusiastic about paying ransoms.
There's a quote from one former slave that really stuck with me. He said, "All of the nations made some shift to live, save only the English, who it seems are not so shiftful as others, and have no great kindness one for another."
Wow. That's pretty damning.
It gets worse. He even talks about witnessing fellow Englishmen dying in captivity because they weren't getting the help they needed.
That's just awful.
It really highlights how these cultural and religious divides within Europe had real-life consequences. It wasn't just some abstract debate. It was literally a matter of life and death for these captives.
Exactly. Their experiences, their suffering, it exposed those rifts in a very real and tragic way.
So, with all these Europeans being captured, facing these brutal conditions, how did this whole Barbary slave trade thing finally lose steam? Was it European might that eventually shut it down?
It's actually a lot more nuanced than just one side winning out. It was a gradual decline with a lot of factors coming into play.
Okay, so walk me through it. What were some of the things that chipped away at their power?
Well, for one, you can't underestimate the impact of European naval power. As their ships got better, their tactics improved, they could put up more of a fight.
Makes sense. They couldn't just raid with impunity anymore.
Exactly. And they even started launching attacks on Barbary ports, turning the tables a bit.
So those coastal raids that we talked about earlier, they weren't as easy to pull off anymore.
Not even close.
Yeah.
The element of surprise was gone, and the risks were just too high. Plus, let's not forget, this was also the time when Europe was really flexing its imperial muscles.
Expanding their own empires, conquering new lands, all that.
Precisely. They were focused on establishing new trade routes, controlling resources, and projecting their power globally. The old trade routes that the Barbary corsairs had been disrupting, they weren't as critical anymore.
So it's like, while the Corsairs were stuck in their old ways, the world was moving on without them.
In a nutshell, yes. Their little corner of the world wasn't so important to the big players anymore.
But it wasn't just what was happening outside the Barbary states, right? There was turmoil from within, too.
Absolutely. We have to remember, the Barbary Coast wasn't this united front. It was a collection of different states, often with their own agendas and rivalries.
So basically, a recipe for conflict.
Pretty much. You had power struggles between rulers, shifting alliances, even internal rebellions. All of that weakened the Corsairs' position over time.
It's like that old saying, a house divided against itself cannot stand.
Exactly. And on top of all that, you even started to see a shift in attitudes towards piracy, even within the Barbary states themselves.
Really? So they were starting to see the writing on the wall.
Some of them were. They realized that maybe this whole piracy thing wasn't such a good look, at least not in the long run.
Plus, it probably didn't hurt that European navies were becoming a bit more persuasive.
A little encouragement never hurts, right?
Right.
But seriously, it was this combination of internal and external pressures that really spelled the end for the Barbary slave trade.
It's kind of like everything that could go wrong did go wrong.
Pretty much. And as a result, this system that had thrived for centuries,
Right.
capturing and enslaving Europeans on a massive scale, it finally crumbled.
It makes you wonder, though, knowing all of this, knowing how deeply this practice was embedded, how it went on for so long, it makes you wonder how differently things might have played out if European powers had felt as threatened by this Barbary slave trade as they did by, say, losing access to spices from the East.
It really makes you think, what if those in charge had experienced that same fear themselves? The fear of being captured, the desperation of being enslaved. Would they have acted with more urgency then?
It's a question worth asking, even if it's a bit unsettling. I mean, think about it. European nations waged wars over nutmeg, cloves, peppercorns. They were obsessed with securing their tea supply. But the suffering of their own people, everyday folks, captured and enslaved, it didn't always seem to be their top priority.
It's a harsh reality, but economic interests and power dynamics often dictate actions, even when we're talking about something as horrific as slavery.
It makes you realize that history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about understanding those forces, those motivations that shaped the course of events. And sometimes it's about confronting those uncomfortable truths about the past.
Absolutely. And for anyone listening who might be thinking, hold on, why haven't I heard about this before? But you're not alone. That's
Yeah.
part of what makes these deep dives so fascinating.
We get to unearth those forgotten chapters, challenge our assumptions, and hopefully come away with a more complete understanding of the past.
It's not just about memorizing facts. It's about grappling with those complexities, the uncomfortable truths, those often overlooked events that have shaped our present.
Well said. And the story of the Barbary slave trade, it's a prime example of that. It's a reminder that slavery in its various forms has left an indelible mark on human history, and we have a responsibility to learn from it.
To confront injustice wherever it rears its head.
Exactly, and to never forget those who suffered under its weight. The Barbary slave trade, even though it's often relegated to the footnotes of history books, it deserves to be told. It deserves to be remembered.
And perhaps even more importantly, it should spark a conversation.
A conversation about how the themes of the story, the power dynamics, the questions of who we value and who we protect, how those themes resonate in our world today.
Because those questions, they're as relevant now as they were centuries ago.
That's something worth pondering long after this deep dive is over. And on that note, my friend, I think we'll wrap up another journey into the hidden corners of history. As always, it's been a pleasure exploring these stories with you.
The pleasure was all mine.
To everyone listening, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep diving deep. Until next time.